It's a name you give to a group of computers. It usually identifies your company. Okay? As you all know, with network communications, it really uses IP addressing to communicate to computers. And what a domain name does, it allows you to associate a more human level, and that is giving a name to all of this. Okay? So when we talk about domains, for example, the company acme.com, and there's actually a great reference within our help center, the basic guide to DNS. There's some great discussions there. When we talk about domain names, we also talk about different levels. The top level domain, as you know, the naming convention goes from right to left. This is called the top level. This is usually referred to as the second level. This really identifies your customer, the company. At the top level, what might we also have besides .com? .net. We might have .net, .gov, .edu. For those of you not in the US, Canadians, what do you have? CA. There's also a top level that has country naming, so on and so forth. So that's usually referred to as the top level. The second level is really what usually identifies the company itself. Okay? So this is typically what we're familiar with. There's actually a third level, and this is very interesting. This is where you can identify your subdomain. So within this entity, which everyone usually refers to as their domain name, I might have another level inside my company. Okay, and that's usually referred to as a subdomain. It's within my domain. Okay, so I think this is what got some people confused typically in our exercise, is even though we worked with a domain alias, we had you create a subdomain, a third level, okay, that you used as an alias. So all a subdomain is within your current domain, you create a third level. When I used to work for a very larger company, even than Google years ago, we used to have within our company a sales.company.com. We had an engineering, and those used to work on our various subnets within the company. Okay, so that's what a subdomain is. What we're going to do in one of our exercises, when we talk about, we're going to have you add another secondary domain. We're going to have that called subsidiary.acme.com, so that you don't have to go out and actually purchase another domain. Okay, very good. So let's talk about a domain alias. So what is an alias? Any type of aliasing, where you talk about user aliases or domain aliases, what is an alias?
It's another name.
It's another name. Okay, so it's an alternate name. Okay, I also like to think of it as a nickname. So it's possible that a company may have registered as acme.com, but they've also registered as .net. And what they want to do is they want to alias this to this. And the whole purpose is when I log into my system or get mail as bschmel@acme.com, when we alias the other domain to my core primary domain, it behaves the same way. It's an alternate name. So that's the whole idea of setting up a domain alias. Okay? So it is possible, just to let you know, that you could have a subsidiary, you could have a subdomain that you set up as an alias to your primary domain. And that's all we had you do in the pre-work. Okay? So you could have an alias that's a subsidiary, you could have an alias that's actually another domain name. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes?
So in that case, does that cost you any more money?
Well, in this case, you have to actually register the second domain. And then that's why in the pre-work, we didn't want you to have to spend another $10, or you may not be able to actually create another domain. So we had you create a subsidiary, or we called it my subdomain. And then we had you make that as your alias. Okay? Now, I find this is a very interesting discussion, because what I want to segue into let me get another marker. no black markers, that's okay. It's the concept of, I want to get into the concept of a primary domain in a moment. Let's finish this discussion here. So we also have what we call a domain registrar. We'll come back to my little brain twist there. So what is a domain registrar?
The company you actually registered the domain with.
So it's a company that you actually register your domain with, and in order to manage a domain, okay, to switch any of the MX records or create CNAME records, as some of you already know, you have to have privileges to actually change that information. Some of you, have access to your company's domain registrar, but you only have view privileges. If you want to make changes, you have to be able to have change privileges to do that. Okay? So what is a CNAME record? Okay, so this is, here's the word alias. It stands for how do you pronounce that? Canonical name, okay, which just really means it's a word name for something, okay, versus a numbering scheme. I also have seen it used as, I like this term, it's a list of your resources. Okay? So for example, under your domain you may have other resources that are accessible, like www. Okay? Or mail. Your domain. Okay? And very often your domain name is referred to as @. It's a simple way, it's sort of a variable that references your domain name. So those of you that were just kind of new to using the DNS service, this is some of the terminology and functionality you have. Okay? How is that used in Google? What were we using the CNAME record for?
It's essentially an alias over your mail, your docs, your calendar.
Okay, very good. To create aliases for some of the resources, shortcuts to calendar, shortcut to mail. But what else? Even before that, when you registered your domain, what was the first thing you had to do? Verify ownership of your domain. Okay, why does Google have you do that?
Because I'm not Microsoft and I can't set up my...
Google cannot just doesn't want to arbitrarily set up an account for a domain that you don't own. Otherwise, you as a reseller could do what? You could register all your prospects, potentially, and they have to buy from you. Wouldn't that be great? Okay? So, and Google can't do that either. So this is a way of us at Google being able to verify that you own your domain, so we allow you to set that up. Okay? So what we have you do is create a CNAME record with some gobbledygook stuff, and we have it point where? To google.com. And if Google successfully is able to bring up google.com, we know that you were able to switch this or add this CNAME record. That's one method of doing it. Okay, very, very important, and it's called verifying domain ownership. So we're just taking advantage of this ability in the domain registrar to for you to create a resource if you own your domain and you can manage it so that we can verify ownership of it. Very important. Okay? So for the Crescendo, what are MX records? MX stands for Mail Exchange Records, and what does that do?
Mail servers where to send mail for your domain.
Exactly. It identifies to the mail servers where mail flows for your domain. Okay? And typically you have multiple entries that have what we call the priority. Okay? And then the host name that you're going to. And then also the TTL. What are the priorities for? Okay, who to talk to first. So it allows the company, when you register your domain, to have backup or alternate servers to contact. So if it can't get to the higher priority first, which has a lower number, in computer science we start counting from 0, right? So these could actually be 1, 2, or 3, or 10. In the US, we typically use a numbering scheme of 10, so there's room to squeeze in another one. Okay? And these are all going to point to where? Some Google, Google number 1, Google number 2, Google number 3. And what is the TTL? Time to live. And what does that mean?
How long before everything refreshes across the internet?
Okay, so how long this is refreshed or cached. And so initially we tell you to do something like a half hour. And that TTL stays with this record that you are currently adding. How long will it take for this record to propagate? Depends on the current MX record that might be out there for your domain to its TTL. Okay? So this time to live is a timing tag that's associated with this new MX record. Okay? If the customer is changing the MX record for an existing domain to point to Google, okay, this won't propagate until the other one expires. So that will determine how long it will take for this new entry to propagate. Just want to point that out. Okay? Everybody with me? Okay. Cool. So let's talk a little bit more in terms of Google. Okay? Because that's what we're here for. So when we talk about Google, we want to make sure we're using the same vocabulary. So at Google, we have the concept of a primary domain. Actually, the whole world has the concept of your primary domain. So at Google, your primary domain is what? Your domain, but which one? Is it your domain alias? Is it your domain? Or it's the ultimate domain that you will be rolling out. Okay? It's the domain that you're going to ultimately go live with, typically. Okay? So in my case, it's going to be acme.com. Okay? From a business perspective, this is the domain that Google's business systems know your account as. Okay? Now, a couple of important things about the primary domain is you may also... So with the primary domain, you may also eventually add domain aliases. Okay? So I want to point out, typically what happens when you run a pilot is, and I want to clarify this now, is you're going to create a subdomain, and you're going to alias it to your primary domain. And when you run dual delivery sends mail to your domain alias. Okay? So during my pilot, I get mail sent to apps.acme.com, but since it's a domain alias, it's really what address? bschmel@acme.com. Now, why do I point this out? I need another board here. So when you're running, this is new material, so I really want to get your feedback. So this is what causes confusions for customers, and maybe for us yesterday. So on Exchange, I have acme.com. What confuses customers is they feel, but when I registered Google Apps, I can't put acme.com there because I already have it registered here. So what the typical thing is they put another domain here and then they try setting it up. And when they get ready to go live, they have to start all over again. Okay? And that's what I want us to prevent in this discussion. What's really important is where what is going right now. Your MX records, okay, particularly during your pilot, is still going to your Exchange server. So it's okay that you've registered with Google Apps, acme.com, but you're not switching your MX records yet. You had to verify ownership of that domain by creating what? A CNAME record. But mail is still flowing where? Exchange. And then what you do is you set up a forwarding rule that does dual delivery to Google Apps. So even though you've registered acme.com here as well, dual delivery forwards it to the user's alias domain, but since it's alias to the primary, it's one and the same. Does this make sense to everybody? Mm-hmm. When you're ready to switch over, what the user does is they then change the MX records to eventually point here. Okay. So we need to understand what a domain is, what a subsidiary domain is, what a subdomain is, a domain alias, to understand how this all fits. Okay? So what we're going to have you do later today is we're going to have you create a subsidiary company, but we don't want you to go out and purchase another domain. What we're going to have you do is create a subdomain for your current training environment, and we're going to have you add it as a secondary domain. So in Google Apps, in addition to a primary domain and a domain alias, you can now have a secondary domain, which basically means another domain, not another necessarily subdomain, but another domain that you're managing within the same control panel. This was one of the biggest feature requests from customers, is my company has different subsidiaries. So we have different primary domains, and you're telling me I now have to have different control panels. I have different admin logins now to get into different control panels. Okay? But since a month ago, customers can now have a secondary domain that they can add to Google Apps.
A secondary or many secondary?
You can actually have many secondary domains. Okay. And I want to wait till we get into multiple domains to talk about that. There are some limitations that the secondary domain will impose on you, which we'll get to in a moment, but I just want to make sure we understand the essentials of domain names and we're all using the same terminology. Okay? If this is not clear to someone, let me know either now or when we get into the exercise. Actually, when you do the exercise, it'll become very clear to me whether you got it or not. Okay? So that's a good thing. So I wanted to make sure we understand all of the terminology. Yes?
So a secondary domain can be either a subdomain or a completely different.
Exactly. Exactly. A level 2 or a level 3 domain.
Okay.
Just to introduce another vocabulary. Sometimes it makes it easier to introduce another vocabulary.
Have you had deployments where the primary domain was a subdomain, in other words, three components?
There may have been, but I typically, the subsidiary here is where the subdomain is where you're sending it to. But yeah, you could do that. Now there's one other thing I wanted to point out. We mentioned this in the exercise, and that is Google Apps also gives you a temporary test domain. So let me show you an account that I have real quick. So we go to my domain settings, and I go to my domain names, and then here we go. So my primary domain is googleappscustomer4.com. Okay, you'll notice that's highlighted here. And I notice I also have a domain alias called apps.googleappscustomer4.com. You probably won't see this anymore on yours, but I set mine up in a way so that it stays. Temporarily, we had a domain set up here called yourdomainname.testgooglea.com. How many of you noticed that when you set up your domain?
Well, once it propagates, it goes away.
Right. So once you set up your MX records, it actually will go away. So does anyone know what the point of the test domain is that Google puts here, and how does it work? What is the point of this?
Just for a test before?
For testing purposes, okay? So the scenario is you registered your domain, you did a CNAME record verification, but where is mail flowing? To your Exchange server still. We have this temporary test domain that somehow through the magic of the power of Google and through the internet, it actually has MX records pointing to Google for that one domain. So essentially what we've done is we've set up a domain alias for your primary domain temporarily so you can test mail flow. So and it will go away eventually after you switch your MX records for your primary domain. If the customer never switches their MX records, it will still stay there. Little side point, if you're using Postini standalone and you didn't switch your MX records ever to Google, that will still stay there. Okay? So I just want to point out, we create this test domain for most of you or all of you that will eventually disappear. We can't promise how long it'll be there, so we don't suggest using it for your pilot, because we can't promise it will be there forever. That's why we talked about setting up a domain alias for your pilot. But essentially, if you understand what a domain alias is, it's behaving the same way, but it doesn't require you to switch your MX records. So how many of you did this pre-work where you sent email to that address? Did we have you do that? And did you receive it? Okay? And you received it as who? Your primary domain. So we just sort of introduced that little tricky thing in the background so that you can test mail flow even before you switch your MX records. Another way of looking at it is just confuses the customer. But now you understand what it is and you'll set that expectation with them. Okay? Now you know why I didn't want to be recorded, Harrison. Okay? So what we're going to do in our discussion now is talk about multiple domains. Okay, so we talked about this, registering your primary domain, and then you're going to add a domain alias. Okay, and we talked about these very important things. So let me point out one thing, is until you switch your MX records, you're going to see this little error message. Okay, if you're working once again with Postini standalone and you never switch your MX records to Google at any point, you will continue to see this message. It just says, it looks like your domain isn't configured correctly. It's just letting you know you haven't switched your MX records yet. So if you have a pilot that runs, you set this up and it's running for several weeks or for a month, you've registered acme.com, but you haven't switched your MX records, you'll see this little message. It's just letting you know you haven't fully activated your primary domain. You can still do other admin tasks like we were doing. You just haven't switched your MX records. Okay? And then the other thing that, once again, I always like to point out is when you are setting up your CNAME record, we strongly suggest that you lower the TTL for your primary domain already, since you're already in your DNS registrar. So when you are ready to switch the domain for the primary, it'll propagate quickly. Okay? Very often, the current primary MX records pointing to your Exchange server will have the maximum amount of time set, which is usually about 7 days or a week. You don't want to have to wait potentially a week for your MX records to switch over. Okay?
Question.
Yes?
What if we have like a GMD or an A&D customer, and we go ahead and they say, okay, well, we've got 10-year retention right now. We want to go to Google Apps, which of course, you have to keep archiving on the Postini side.
Maybe we can talk about this later or offline. Okay?
It's a little bit more.
I know where you're coming from. I want to try to keep us focused on domain because it's confusing enough.
Yeah, I'll write it down.
Okay? Very good. So let's talk about multiple domains. So as I mentioned, this is a new feature in Google Apps. It's available in Premier and Education. In 2 weeks, that'll be called what? Google Apps for Business and Google Apps for Education. Okay? It will not be available in Standard, which will just be called Google Apps. And the whole idea here is now within the same control panel, so through the same administrator login, you can now manage and collaborate between all of your domains. So in addition to having your primary domain, you can also have subsidiary companies. Now those subsidiaries could be, other two-level domains. They could be really subsidiaries, but you're now able to add another domain, not just a domain alias, which means I can now have users at another company name, user at another company name, not just my primary domain name. Does that make sense? Okay, very, very important. So the whole goal here is to make collaboration and sharing a lot easier, and also administration. So with all good things, there are limitations, at least when they first come out. So I can't tell you if this is going to change or when it changed. So what I want to talk about is some of the limitations. So the first big one is the only domain that can have aliases, listen to this, is the primary domain. When I go into my control panel, wherever it may be, here it is, and I try to add a domain alias, it only allows me to alias it to what? My primary. Notice there's no checkbox to actually set it up to a secondary domain. See my subsidiary, do you notice that? It's active. It's not a domain alias, it's not a primary, so it's a secondary. Okay? So when you click on add a domain and want to make it an alias, it will only be alias to this. Okay? So this could be acme.net, okay? Or it could be subsidiary dot, and this could be my second subsidiary. You see that? So when I can add another domain as a secondary or an alias to the primary. Very, very important. Don't set the wrong expectation with your customer.
Is there a possibility in the future they're going to allow that?
That's what I was saying. I don't know. I'm not the product manager. We've asked the question. I don't know. Salim, have you heard any more about it? I don't know. As soon as I know, I promise we'll let you know.
Can I just clarify that?
Yes.
Because I think I have a situation that would exactly be restricted by that limitation. I've got a customer, they've got 5 subsidiaries, let's say, A, B, C, D, and E. Someone who is in the E subsidiary really identifies themselves as the E subsidiary. They would not want their primary email address or their login to be their name
Right.
at E. But they do need, they're actually a Postini customer also, they receive mail at A, B, C, D, and E. We need them to continue to be able to receive mail at A, B, C, D, and E. Everyone needs to get it A through E, but each person in that bucket needs to have their identity be
Sure.
D.
So
Is that the limitation we're talking about here?
So that if you want to add them as alias, well, there's other things. You could have them set up an alias, but all be an alias to the primary, and they can get mail that way.
Could they still log in as
That's the other
A
thing.
and D or E?
Very good. So the law. This is I'm glad you're asking that, because here is the list. Do I have the list of limitations? Let me go to the limitations really quick.
You create users, you just create whatever domain. Like
No.
Joe
Right.
A,
And that's how
Susie
they are
at C.
today. They're rob@c.com, but they get mail at AD.
So one of the limitations is before we go off on and is here's a subset of the list of limitations, but I think that they're some of the big eliminators. Okay. First of all, when you set up a secondary domain, so you have a Google Apps account that has a primary and also secondaries, okay, the administrator must have email address at the primary domain to access the control panel. So the admin, so even though you can add a user to your secondary domain and click on give them admin privileges, it'll want to log them into the primary domain. It's kind of a weird scenario. Their administrator privileges must be assigned as a login to the primary domain. So it's possible in some situations they may want to get their personal email at the subsidiary, that costs you 1 license, but their admin login will be at the primary. That's how it works today. Number 2, you cannot set different configuration settings nor policies for different domains. Okay. So for example, the custom URL you can set for the primary domain, but not the secondary. You can't create a shortcut for that. Those are some of the limitations today. Okay. It could discourage people, but that's how it works today. Domain alias is supported for the primary only. You cannot set different configuration. I mentioned that one. When we talk about organization settings, those are done at the user level. Okay? Email and contact delegation does not work across domains. You cannot attach additional, this is a big one. There's 2 big ones here. You cannot activate the integrated Postini service if you have added a secondary domain. And vice versa. So I have multiple domains here. I want to get us into the exercise. So I've added a secondary domain. So when I go to my dashboard and you try to add the Postini service, you get this error message. Postini services currently only support single domain, although they do support aliases. So in our lab exercise, we're going to have to do some cleanup at the end of today, because after you do this exercise, if you want to use Postini, you have to get rid of your secondary domains, okay? Or set up standalone Postini. I just want you to see this for right now. Vice versa, if I had an account that already had Postini set up, and then you try to add a secondary domain, that's the example you see here, you'll get the error message. So if you already have Postini enabled and you try to add a secondary domain, you'll see this error message, very similar. Please remove Postini services integrated in apps before you can add a secondary domain. Okay, I just want you to be in the know. Okay, I want you to know a day before the error message that your customer will see tomorrow. So you can say, oh yeah, let me explain this to you. That's my goal this week. Okay? In other companies I used to say 2 weeks, but now sometimes you may just know the day before the customer finds out. Okay? So you definitely want to read this article about limitations. Okay? Let me go back here real quick. Just want to make sure we just go through the mechanics. So the multiple domains is currently, at least for the next couple of weeks, only available as next generation US only. Okay, so if you want to tinker with that, you can enable that. And as I mentioned, you'll go to your domain settings. This will also enable the new settings of organizations and users, by the way, which we'll talk about after lunch. And now you can create a secondary domain. Okay? And then the mechanics for that are exactly what I was showing you here. I go to my domain settings, and then I can go ahead and add another domain, a secondary domain. But I'm not going to create it as an alias. I'm going to create it as just as a secondary domain. Okay? So let me just spend a few more minutes with you. So as you add the secondary domain, what we're going to do in our class, so you don't have to buy another domain, is we're going to have you add a subdomain as your subsidiary company. Unless you want to spend another $10 and buy another 2-level domain name, which is fine. Okay? You're going to use your DNS registrar and create a subdomain, just like you did yesterday for your subdomain alias, but you're not going to add it as an alias. Okay? I just want to spend a few minutes to clarify some things because I know there was confusion around this. So when you add a subsidiary, or excuse me, a subdomain as your domain or domain alias, you'll notice it tells you you have to create this CNAME record pointing to google.com. Okay? Now, since it's a subsidiary domain, I want to point out the following. What you're going to add into your domain registrar is the following. That character string dot, oops, the subsidiary name. And it will point to google.com. Okay? So that's what it's going to look like in your CNAME when you go to your domain controller. Very, very important. If it was truly a 2-level domain, such as solomora.com, you just put in the string, the Google string, as your CNAME entry, and it points to google.com. Since you're doing this as a subdomain, you have to tag on the subdomain name to that string. And the idea is that when you click on that URL that's pointing to google.com, that page will come up. That's how you know you typed it correctly. It could take a little bit of time for Google to actually verify domain ownership, and that's why I want to make sure we do that exercise before lunch. Okay? And then eventually you do have to switch the MX records, and the instructions are there for you as well. Typically you're going to add 5 entries. This is for GoDaddy. So for your subsidiary or your secondary domain, they're going to point to the same Google servers. Okay? But for our exercise, we're only going to have you do one of these entries just to save time. Okay? As I mentioned, when you change MX records, you have to consider time. We went through this. We talked about the error message you will get temporarily until you switch your MX records. Okay? The other nice thing is we've improved the domain status information in the control panel as well. Okay? And don't forget, you have to verify domain ownership for each domain in order to add any users to it. Okay? So let me show you real quick here. When you eventually do add a user, so if I want to create a new user, the only way you will see your secondary domain listed is after you've completed CNAME record verification. That's one way of knowing that Google has verified ownership. Why am I pointing this out? Because in the exercise you're going to get really excited, you're going to add the subsidiary domain, you're going to do this, and then the exercise says add a user to the subsidiary, and you don't see your subsidiary here yet. That's because the CNAME record was not verified. Okay? And that time can vary. Okay. So let me show you what your exercise is, because we definitely want to do this before lunch. And I'm open to anyone's feedback. Like I said, this is a new exercise.